My name is Grzymala-Busse, and I am the director of the Europe Center here at Stanford. I'm along with Kathryn Stoner, who is the director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law.
On, not for. On.
We run the Rethinking European Development and Security Speaker Series, which is also kindly sponsored by the Hoover Institution. So welcome to our first session. This was a delayed but very eagerly awaited session with Kim Scheppele, who is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She's also a faculty fellow at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University and at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. She's currently a visiting professor here at Stanford Law School. Kim is an expert on constitutional law, the erosion of democracy, and the ways in which the law can be weaponized by would-be autocrats. She's spent extended time doing research in Russia, Hungary, and the hallways of the European Union. In short, she is the expert on the topic of her talk today, the EU's democracy deficit. So please join me in welcoming our esteemed guest.
Because usually when I'm speaking, I kind of know a little bit about the audience. So let me ask just two questions to know what level of detail to talk about. So
Your microphone's off.
Oh, my microphone's off. Right. Sorry. I turned it off because I was trying to, you gave it to me when there it is. Okay, there. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So then that's not on tape or whatever. Okay, so just a couple of questions. So first of all, this is basic background knowledge about the EU. So if I talk about the Commission, the Council, do people know what that is? Yes. Okay, good. Then on EU law, does anybody know the difference between an infringement and a preliminary reference? Probably not. Okay, that was what I guessed. Okay, so this just tells me like how much I need to explain. So first of all, welcome here, and I am going to be talking primarily about the EU, though. If in the Q&A you want to get into the influences of some of this stuff happening in Europe to what's happening here, that's what I've been doing a lot of the last 10 months. So first of all, let me start by giving you a little bit of law, which is that the European Union is obviously a body that is held together by its treaties, which act like a constitution for the EU, although you can't use that word for various historical reasons. But this article starts the Treaty of European Union, and it's an article that, how to put it, reflects the values of the EU. And it's an article of the treaty, like every other article of the treaty, except that until very recently, no one thought this was legally enforceable. And what it tells you, the Union is founded on values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, et cetera. Okay, and so this actually lays out the values groundwork. And for those of you who know American law, citing this in any legal document, whether as what we call a legal basis, which is a ground for creating further legislation, or in a brief or in any kind of legal document, if you cited this as binding law, everybody would look at you like, obviously you don't know what you're doing. The way that if you cited the preamble to the US Constitution in a brief or something would be the same, right? Because it's aspirations, but it's not really law. Now, from the very beginning, going back to before the Treaty of European Union, the EU has long been thought to have what's called a democratic deficit. And this is just a little map that the green are the citizens of the member states. And citizens of member states get to vote in two contexts. They get to vote for their national governments, and then they get to vote directly for the European Parliament, which now has 720 members directly elected in the different member states. All those blue, dark blue entities are EU bodies, but only the Parliament is directly elected. How do the others get there? Well, the European Council, which is where the heads of state and government sit as what's often called EU summit meetings. They're the heads of state and government that were elected by the citizens of their respective countries or elected by the parliaments of those countries in a parliamentary system. Ditto with the Council of the EU. So the Council of the EU is a complicated body in which, depending on the topic, the cabinet ministers that cover different topics sit in formation. So the environmental ministers will sit in one council, the justice ministers in another. But again, it's the cabinets, it's the executives of the member states. None of them are directly elected either. They're usually, appointed or elected by their parliaments, et cetera, or appointed by presidents or prime ministers. The European Commission consists of one commissioner from every member state, nominated by the member state, and there's a vetting process that they go through. But again, not directly elected there either. And so as the EU has developed this idea that somehow the most powerful bodies, because really the Commission is the main kind of brain of the whole thing, the executive branch, and only the European Commission, by the way, has the legal ability to initiate legislation. You can't get it out of the parliament, you can't get it out of the council. That's really indirectly elected, right? So if the citizens elect their heads of state or government, the heads of state or government or the cabinets nominate the commissioners, double remove. So this has been the source of what was originally called the democratic deficit. We can talk also about who gets onto the Court of Justice. As the EU's developed, it's become slightly more democratic in the sense that the parliament has become more and more directly elected. There's now a discussion about the creation of parties that might cut across, like now when you vote in your national elections for members of the European Parliament, you're voting for people on the party lists that are parties in your country. And then those parties align with Europe-wide parties once they get to the European Parliament. But it may be the case that you would want to vote for a party at European level that has no party in your country that allows you to vote for them, right? And so the whole thing, even with the parliament, the democratic mandate is a bit attenuated. Over time, the parliament's gained more powers. So now the parliament actually has the ability across most areas of EU legislation to veto or suggest modifications of legislation, and the parliament's approval is necessary for most topics. The parliament also now can veto individually or collectively commissioners who might sit in the European Commission. And the parliament's gotten a bit more active in that regard. But still, if you think that you need direct democratic accountability, EU institutions are, shall we say, lacking. And so, the European Commission is not, it sort of repeats what I've just said, only the parliament's directly elected, and even that's attenuated. All right. So what was the solution? This was a big debate if you go back to the Europe literature on the EU, particularly in the 70s and 80s, before the parliament got some of its new powers. The idea was, well, the EU is not anti or undemocratic because the EU, all the EU institutions are populated by people who are from governments that were themselves democratically elected, right? So it all piggybacks off the democratic legitimacy of the member states. And then that kind of stopped the debate. All right, but now we have this problem, which is we have at least one member state that virtually all EU democracy raters agree is no longer a democracy. And we have another member state that went through a near miss and it's not out of the woods yet. And other states that are declining. This is a little map that shows you, in fact, it might be a little hard to read from that distance, but the kind of purple, more or less straight line at the top is the average of the varieties of democracy, electoral democracy index. That's sort of the EU average, which has held more or less constant. The pink line that sort of goes across at the bottom is the global average of scores on this kind of EU democracy index. And that blue line that goes straight down is after 2010 is Hungary. It's now below the world average on electoral democracy scores. And the sort of middle blue line that kind of goes down and then kicks back up at the end, that's Poland. I think they exaggerate how much that ticks up at the end after the Polish election, which we'll talk about. So you've basically got countries, and also just for good measure, you've got Romania and Bulgaria. They were admitted to the EU with a little asterisk because they clearly didn't meet all the standards for liberal democracy when they were admitted. And there was a special mechanism that was used to give them extra reviews, extra assessments, and they weren't admitted to all the aspects of the EU when they were admitted because of their declining scores. And now Hungary's way below, both of them. All right, so here's the problem. You've got countries that no longer meet the standards for admission to the EU. And so the question is, what can the EU do about this, given that the solution to the original democratic deficit problem was, well, the member states are democratic. Okay, so now not. So now what? So I'm just going to quickly go over what happened in Hungary and Poland. Many of you will know this. But when Viktor Orban was elected in 2010, he started right off the bat passing lots of laws through his compliant parliament and really changed the entire legal structure of the country and the entire democratic culture of the place. So first, they captured the Constitutional Court. They captured the judiciary. I can go through an exquisite legal detail. Every step was legal. Attacked civil society organizations, passed a new constitution 1 year in, which really heavily consolidated power in the prime minister's office. They've attacked academic freedom. Probably most of you know the story of Central European University pushed out of the country. What's happened to the Hungarian universities is far worse. Ask me in the Q&A. Silencing of critical media. Actually, just as of 2 weeks ago, one of Orban's oligarchs bought the last remaining not oligarch-controlled daily newspaper in Hungary. All these xenophobic, anti-Roma, anti-migrant, anti-Semitic, anti-EU mass campaigns at election time, massive corruption financed by EU funds. And then, since we're thinking about democracy, which should at least have, not exclusively, but importantly, a kind of electoral component, Orban changed all the election laws in 2013 before he was up for re-election in 2014. I have a piece on this in the Journal of Democracy, thanks to your House Journal, kind of, on the details of all of that. And so the elections in 2014, 18, and 22 were rigged. I have a lot of slides if you want to know how. All right, so by 2020, I think actually Hungary had stopped being a democracy in 2013, but it takes democracy raiders a long time to catch up. By 2020, the Varieties of Democracy report says the EU now has its first non-democratic member state. Hungary is an electoral authoritarian regime and is the most extreme recent case of autocratization. It still remains the only country that's gone from consolidated democracy to electoral autocracy in the space of less than a decade. And so here you've got this. The European Parliament, which had been passing, they were the ones who were on this early, starting in 2013, was their first report saying Hungary's in trouble, lights are flashing red. In 2022, they passed a resolution with overwhelming support, actually, that took a long time to get that level of overwhelming support. The resolution said there is increasing consensus among experts that Hungary is no longer a democracy. So it's no longer a fringe view. It's really been certified, including by the EU itself. All right. While this was going on, Poland followed suit. Actually, I should say 2015 rather than 14 in the title. For 2015, Poland had simultaneous, actually they were separated by a few months, but a presidential election that brought a president to power from the so-called Peace Party or the Law and Justice Party. And then later in the year, both houses of the Polish parliament came to be dominated by the same party. Very unusual because Poland's electoral scheme has lent itself toward coalition governments. And while this was sort of formally a coalition government, it was really a sort of pro-autocratic, anti-democratic government. And they very quickly started attacking the judiciary. The outgoing civic platform government had overreached. There were 2 appointments that government was entitled to fill and 3 that were going to come up after the election. They changed the law at the last minute to give themselves the power to elect 5 judges. The new government came in and refused to recognize any of the 5 judges appointed to the Constitutional Tribunal, even though the Constitutional Tribunal, which is ruling as it's the subject of all the problems, said 2 of the judges were legitimately elected, 3 were not. The government paid no attention, swore in 5 new judges to the court and off to the races with constitutional capture, appointed a president of the new tribunal, violating the rules of the tribunal itself. The Constitutional Court was the first victim. Then the government started attacking the rest of the judiciary. They went after the National Judicial Council. In most European countries, it's the Judicial Council that is in charge of appointing judges to the ordinary courts. They packed that with politicians to ensure that the new judges were, shall we say, politically correct, according to the new government. They then created a couple of new chambers of the Supreme Court of Poland, one of which was there simply to discipline judges that were referred to it by this new National Judicial Council. So many judges were suspended or removed or demoted for the rulings they made against what the government wanted them to rule. This is sort of happening over a space of years. They created then something that was called by the opposition, the muzzle law, which created new crimes to be punished, but also made it possible to criminally punish judges who were arguing things like, actually, EU law has direct effect in the supreme over national law. And then the Constitutional Court started with a series of decisions that refused to recognize EU law or European human rights law in the name of what was called constitutional identity. All right, so the government changed hands in 2023, but it's still stuck in a period of autocratic capture. And I'll talk a little bit about the 2023 election in a second. It was a very close election. I will refer to the parties as pro-autocratic and pro-democratic. You could say left and right, but that's not really quite what was at issue in the election. There was a new government that came to power in 2023, but the problem is that the presidency remained in the hands of a Law and Justice Party person who can still veto any law that the new pro-democratic forces would pass. And the Constitutional Tribunal was still captured. So anything the government tried to do that wasn't a new law, but that the Constitutional Tribunal could review, could be declared unconstitutional. So the new government was just stuck. And as a result, it couldn't do anything, couldn't follow through on its campaign promises. And so just a few months ago, there was an election for the presidency again. And peace, again, very closely contested. You probably can't see how close that election is, which is in tiny, tiny print above those little blue and red squares at the bottom. But it was separated by less than a percentage point. And peace, shall we say, the pro-autocratic party, got a new president elected. So they're not out of the woods yet. All right, so here's where we have the democratic deficit. It's still really present in both countries. Hungary has become more and more autocratically captured. Poland looked like it improved, but in fact, it can't change any of the things that were the result of this autocratic capture. So here's the problem. Even if EU member states are not democracies, they still have a seat at the table in the European Council. They still have a designated European commissioner. They still have, of course, their cabinet members in the Council of Ministers. Members of the parliament can be elected, sometimes in tainted elections. And they have a judge at the European Court of Justice and 2 judges at the General Court. So they're in the system for all the reasons that we saw. Okay, and because even though most forms of legislation require what's called qualified majority voting and doesn't require unanimity anymore, there are some crucial issues where you need every single member state on board. For common foreign and security policy, the main thing this now covers is Ukraine. So all the votes on Ukrainian accession, on aid to Ukraine, providing weapons, et cetera, have to go through a unanimity procedure. And everything having to do with the budget goes through a unanimity procedure, and accession, anything about accession countries. And then there's some other issues too, but those are the 3 where particularly Hungary, but sometimes jointly with Poland, will just simply say, we will not go along with everybody else. And then Hungary's become expert at saying, we're not going to go along with everybody else unless you give us X. And they've been using that as leverage to avoid sanctions on themselves. Also, what's been happening is that in the last EU election last year, they're now, the far-right parties gained a lot. This was not an accident. We now know that we didn't know quite at the time, but the evidence has come out since, that Viktor Orban was using a lot of Hungarian state government money to support far-right candidates across Europe through social media, primarily on Facebook. But Orban was adding to the promotion of those parties. And there were not clear EU laws preventing that. There now is a new law coming on board preventing political parties from advertising through social media as a reaction to what Orban did last time. But all of this resulted in this big campaign for the far right. After the dust settled after the 2024 European Parliament elections, it turned out that Orban was able to cobble together the 3rd largest political party in the European Parliament, the so-called Patriots for Europe. This is their program, which is, shall we say, Eurosceptical, pro-nationalist, and wants the EU to be there primarily as an ATM, but not for values, shall we say. And so again, it's affecting the EU institutions themselves, now including the parliament. So I don't know, this got almost no play here because the US media has a lot to focus on. But this was discovered kind of last month, that Viktor Orban had actually created a spy network inside the EU. They recruited all these people to give them information about what was happening across the EU in rooms that the Hungarians were not admitted to. Fortunately, they botched it and it was exposed. But still, we don't know exactly how long this had been going on for. The person who coordinated it was the Hungarian commissioner sitting in the European Commission. And so I can give you the site to all of this. So again, the Hungarians were just any room they were excluded from because people were talking about what do we do about Hungary. They tried to get spies into those rooms so that they were never surprised. Okay, so the EU has been really quite seriously, shall we say, undermined already by the lack of democratic states by having non-democratic states in its midst. Okay, so you would think that there would be a plan for that. And wasn't there a plan? And there was a plan. If you go back through all the documents, particularly since the Big Bang accessions that happened after the fall of the wall, there was this thought that, was spurred on by, political scientists. If you read political science wisdom from the 1980s, everybody thought that if you had become a consolidated democracy, it was, to borrow from a colleague here, the end of history, right? Or that a country that voluntarily got itself into that state would never go back. And so as a result, the EU was set up with that in mind, saying that if a country went through all these hurdles to get to be an EU member state, a lot of those focused on anti-corruption and pro-democracy and ensuring that the institutions of liberal democracy were entrenched enough to make you believe that the country was going to join already as a consolidated democracy. Again, Romania, Bulgaria had those exceptions and that special mechanism because they didn't completely qualify. The thought was if you'd been through that, that was it. And so they didn't design anything for once you got in, either continued monitoring of the kind of monitoring that had accompanied accession or really anything else. All there was in the treaties was Article 7 of the Treaty on European Union. There's a really interesting, complicated history of this, which I won't go into, but it has essentially two parts. The first part basically says, if EU values are in danger, like if a country looks like it's not adhering to those values that we looked at in Article 2, then 2/3 of the Parliament and 4/5 of the Council can give a warning. Okay, so again, it's like we see you're in trouble, but a warning with no sanctions at all. To cut to the chase, we've never gotten that level of agreement so far. But there's part two. Part two says if EU values are actually breached. Okay, so the first one is just we think you're in trouble, like you're careening off the road a bit. We want to stop you and do a breathalyzer, kind of. That's part one. Part two is you've gone off the road, you're in a ditch. Okay, so if the values are breached, then 2/3 of the Parliament plus a unanimous European Council. Okay, now if you dig in and it's not the member state in question, obviously can't vote. Okay, but every other member state can vote. Unanimous council can declare there's been a breach, and then it goes to the Council of Ministers, which can impose sanctions by qualified majority vote. So that was the system they put in place. All right. So Article 7.1, the warning, we think you're in trouble, you need the breathalyzer, was declared in 2017 for Poland, actually pretty fast because that was only 2 years in. And it took until 2018 before Article 7.1 was triggered for Hungary. That's long after everything was gone, so, and we can talk about why Poland got more attention than Hungary. The short answer is everything Hungary did was legal. When the Polish government did this, they breached their own law. That was much easier for the Commission and the EU institutions to recognize, and so they got involved sooner. So Article 7.1 was triggered. Many of us thought it would produce the image upper left, which it did not do. Instead, it produced more the image bottom right, which is that everybody acted like it hadn't happened. The General Affairs Council, one configuration of the Council of Ministers, has these closed-door hearings in which governments claim to be seriously questioning the rogue states. They don't produce minutes. Everybody comes out smiling, so it doesn't really look like it's actually been particularly effective. These two procedures, the one for Poland is now closed after the election, the one for Hungary is still open. They have never been able to get to the 4/5 vote And actually, I'm kind of glad they didn't, because if they voted that there was a warning, it would come with no sanctions. As long as the procedure is open, they periodically haul Hungary in and give them a hard time, and that's probably more effective than closing the procedure. But still, what it meant was, as long as you had Hungary and Poland, given the way Article 7.2 was set up, you could not get to the point of sanctioning either, assuming that the political will was there, which it never was. But even so, once you have two rogue states and you need unanimity of all the states to do sanctions against one, once you got two rogue states acting in coalition, the whole system disappears. I have a whole article about why it shouldn't, and why you can get around it, but it's moot now. All right, so now what? The democracy deficit problem within the EU has persisted and has really gotten worse. So now what? All right, so the first thing is like, what were the remedial tools? The first thing is that the European Commission has the possibility of taking a member state to court if the member state is violating EU law. Okay, it's called an infringement action. And the Commission in general has been very reluctant to do this. When Hungary was going through its big constitutional revolution in 2011-12, that was when they put in the new constitution. That's when they captured a lot of the institutions. Like I said, it was really over by spring 2013 in terms of, everything was so rigged that it would take a miracle to bring it back. The Commission knew that, and I'll just say that, I was working with the Commission myself from 2011 on, going to meetings with, the top with Barroso, with Reding, and they knew. So they were completely informed, they were completely alarmed, and they felt like they didn't have the law to do anything with. So I just say my own involvement in this started then, like, how do we build the law to do that? That's what I've been doing the last 15 years. And so they would try to bring infringement actions, like, how is Hungary violating EU law? One of the things the Hungarians did was to lower the judicial retirement age. Hungary has a civil service judiciary, like most countries, not the US, where you go to law school, you become a baby judge, you get promoted through the system until the most senior judges, the judges on the Supreme Court, have had a career of being a judge. That also means they're older. So when you suddenly lower the judicial retirement age with no warning, in Hungary's case, they lopped off the top 15% of the judiciary and allowed all those top positions to be filled with new appointments, because they'd also captured the system for appointing judges. This happened then in Poland in slightly different ways. The EU stared at this and said, this is an infringement of judicial independence, but we don't have any law. The treaties don't say anything about judicial independence. So they brought an action against Hungary for age discrimination. And they won, wow, it's like age discrimination. But what's the remedy for age discrimination? You compensate the people who were discriminated against, but you don't give them back their jobs. So what this did, the Commission brought the case and won, and it made no difference. Orban still filled all those jobs with other people. And then the Commission insisted those people should get protection, special protection from any further firings in the middle of. So anyway, it all backfired, and they did something similar with the data protection officer. So the Commission just had no idea what to do. What else should the Commission have done? This was when I mentioned I was working with the Commission. I knew no EU law, okay? So I said, gee, why don't you enforce the values of Article 2? Everybody laughed. And so I said, well, why don't you bring these infringement actions where at least you bundle together a bunch of the stuff that Hungary's been doing, so you can see that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and then tie it together with Article 2. So they said, well, that's interesting, write a paper. So I wrote a working paper for the Commission. I got to present it at this big rule of law symposium the Commission organized in 2012. Every EU lawyer laughed at me and said, you obviously don't know EU law. Article 2 is unenforceable, and this will never happen. But I knew the Commission was interested. Okay, so what happened? So the Commission still kept, this is with regard to Hungary, brought a bunch of half-hearted infringement actions on very specific things. They never bundled together all the stuff. They never used Article 2 until very recently. About this more in a minute. They brought a whole series of cases. I just listed some here. I can go through all the cases, but none of them rattled Orban's regime. They didn't get to the reasons why autocracy had really entrenched itself in Hungary. Even when the Commission won these cases, it won every case. They didn't follow up. They didn't go back. One of the other things I proposed in that 2011-12 working paper at the Commission was to say, okay, you get the judgment against the country. There is a treaty provision where if the country doesn't live up to the judgment, you can go back and get a fine. And I said, so go back and fine them. And then what you do is you get the fine and you deduct it from all the money you're paying these countries subsidizing them. That's another thing everybody laughed at. Okay, so all that was like my first intervention in 2012, in which I proved to the world I knew no EU law, or else I would never have said any of those things. Okay, so, and the commission never went back and got the fines. All right. And so that said, the European Court of Justice saw before any of the other institutions how serious a threat autocracy would be in the middle of the EU. They were on fire. They wanted to do something. And they used the opportunity of a preliminary reference case out of Portugal. Hold this thought. I know you don't know what a preliminary reference is, but they got this case. What a preliminary reference case is you can get a case to the Court of Justice either because the commission sues a member state. You go straight to the Court of Justice, or an issue arises in a member state. It goes to an ordinary judge in a member state, and the ordinary judge says, I think EU law bears on this, but I'm looking through all the EU law books. I don't know what the answer is. So what they do is they stop the action in the case before them, and they refer the case to the Court of Justice saying, would you please advise me on how to understand what EU law is I should apply in my case? The ECJ will then take the preliminary reference, make a decision kind of in the abstract about that principle of law. Then the ECJ decision goes back to the judge who made the reference, and they figure out how to apply it to the case. Okay, that's the preliminary reference procedure. So in Portugal, after the financial crisis, the government had put in place an austerity program in which they lowered the salaries of everybody working for government by 5%. The judges challenged this, saying, this affects our independence. You can't change our salaries. It's in our constitution that you can't change our salaries. So they went to the Court of Justice, and in this 2018 case on the Portuguese judges, the Court of Justice said, no, it's not a violation of EU law to lower your salary by 5%. But while we're talking about this, it turns out if they had done something else more intrusive on what judges are up to, it would have been a violation of the treaties, because there is an Article 19.1, for those keeping track, which says that every state has to have a way of providing effective remedies if EU law is violated. And they said, making it up. That requires that every state maintain an independent judiciary. And how do we know that? Because of Article 2 of the Treaty on European Union, which promises the rule of law. Boom. Okay. This was just a huge event. Suddenly, Article 2 was legally enforceable. Suddenly, everybody starts citing my articles in which I had kept insisting Article 2 was legally enforceable. The court just opened the door to this, and it established this fundamentally new legal principle, both that you could directly enforce Article 2 and that judicial independence was a requirement. And that was what Poland had been going after. Poland had done much more damage to its courts. In Orban's case, it was always hard for him to capture everything. All right. So once that happened, then goes back to, the commission suddenly realizes, aha. So the commission starts bringing all these infringement actions against Poland on judicial independence for violating Article 2, Article 19.1. But it wasn't until Portugal just gave them this accidental case. That wasn't the Portuguese government, by the way. It's just a random judge in Portugal aggrieved about this 5% cut in his salary, right? That got the case to the Court of Justice, but they used that, and the Court of Justice knows Poland is coming, Hungary is coming. They make the decision, by the way, in which they found there was no threat to judicial independence in Portugal, but they lay out the principles. The commission finally takes the hint. They bring over the next couple of years 5 different infringement actions against different aspects of what Poland's doing to its judiciary. The ECJ wholeheartedly agrees with all the infringement actions and keeps dinging Poland one after another. The problem is, of course, the commission actually fails to enforce the decisions. They fail to seek what's called interim measures. What interim measures, those of you following the US have now learned all about preliminary injunctions, or you stop the action until we can sort out what the answer is. So you have that equivalent in the EU. It's called an interim measure, where you say the government can't do anything until we find out whether what they're doing is legal. That's what the commission should have done. It didn't do that. So Poland's firing all its judges while these cases are pending. And so, finally, the commission returns to the ECJ under Article 260 to get a fine. They get a big fine, €1 million a day, for not honoring these judgments on judicial independence. And then quietly, because Poland then says we're not going to pay any of this, then quietly they say, oh, and now we're going to deduct it from the money we would already send to Poland. Going back to my article from 2012, which everybody said she doesn't know any EU law because obviously you can't do this. The commission just decided it was going to do this. So I feel a little vindicated. All right. But here's the problem. This happens against a backdrop in which the European Commission had been in general not bringing infringement actions. This is from a paper by my co-author, Dan Kellerman, and my former student, Tom Pavone, called Where Have All the Infringements Gone? The gray line tells you I don't know if you can see it, it goes from 1978 to 2018. The gray line marks the number of what are called formal letters of formal notice. That's when the commission says to a member state, we think you're in trouble. We think you may be violating EU law. We're going to give you advance notice, like clean it up. And then if they go through several warnings and they don't fix it, then it results in the black line, which is we're going to take you to the court. This tells you how many of those things were filed over time. And what's even more shocking when you look at this picture is this is just absolute numbers. This is when the EU is expanding. Right, when they practically double the number of member states in the Big Bang expansion of 2004, and countries that were on the edge, right? They've just become newly consolidated democracies, and even though the number of infringements just falls off a cliff, at the same time that Orban's consolidating power when he comes to power in 2010, and it's still low. Actually, they've published an update. So just when you could use this mechanism, and just when the Court of Justice is reaching out and saying, bring us cases, we really want to deal with this, the commission doesn't really want to deal with this. All right. So then how else can you fight backsliding states? So I'd already come out with this thing in 2012 saying cut their money. That wasn't working. So Dan Kellerman and I wrote this piece in Verfassen's blog saying, how can you stop funding autocrats? And we went through a very technical analysis about how they could use something called the Common Provisions Regulation. If you've never heard of it, there's a good reason. Only auditors and accountants read this. It's like 300 pages of how you account for all the EU money you've gotten. But in there were some provisions, including this one, Article 142A, for those keeping track, that allowed money to be cut if there was, quote, a serious deficiency in the effective functioning of the management and control system of the operational program. So what we were arguing was that if you have a ton of corruption, if you have no checks and balances left in a country, how can you possibly spend EU money in an appropriate way? As we wrote, surely a country without the rule of law cannot generate effective management and control systems. Okay, so we published this in early 2018. There was starting to be a kind of conversation at that time about maybe we should find a way to cut the funds. And what happened later in 2018 is the commission, rather surprisingly, came out with this thing called the Rule of Law Conditionality Regulation, which was going to condition the receipt of EU funds on observing rule of law principles. Okay. Now, this got Hungary and Poland's attention, as you could imagine, because big chunks of both countries' budgets come from EU subsidies. And so they threatened to veto this immediately. This came out as part of a package of new laws. So the EU comes out with a new, what's called the multi-annual financial framework, better known as the budget. Every time they pass a budget, they also pass other laws regulating how the budget is to be used, including a new common provisions regulation each time. And so what happened was that Hungary and Poland threatened to veto the budget. That's the one where you need unanimity, unless they dropped the conditionality regulation. And so this went to the wire. I mean, it was December 2020 when the new budget was supposed to take effect the next month, that there was a European Council meeting, very tense meeting. Angela Merkel was in the chair because Germany had actually, she wasn't in Germany was in the chair of the Council of Ministers, but she was the most influential person at that meeting, brokered a compromise through which Hungary and Poland agreed to let the conditionality regulation go through, as long as it wouldn't take effect before the next Hungarian election. That wasn't what the wording was, but when you looked at all the things they agreed to, that was the effect. All right. So the rule of law conditionality regulation was really good because it defines rule of law very broadly. Rule of law includes the principles of legality, legal certainty, prohibition of arbitrariness, et cetera. And it says, this is the quote, "The rule of law shall be understood as having regard to the other union values and principles enshrined in Article 2. That's in the statute, that's in the regulation. However, as the thing went through the process, Hungary and Poland battered away at it in the council, in the parliament, and eventually you could only cut funds if the funds could be, you could show that the funds were directly not spent properly because of rule of law problems. The budget nexus, which greatly narrowed the scope and proving that a problem with the independent judiciary has affected who got a grant. It's just not easy. So it was really very limited. One of the features of the compromise was that they said, the Hungary and Poland said, we're going to challenge this before the European Court of Justice. Obviously, this is illegal. They challenged it before the Court of Justice, which, by the way, you can tell, right? The Court of Justice is like, bring us cases, bring us cases. They really wanted this case. In February 2022, the European Court of Justice says not only that the regulation is lawful, right, but, and then they turbocharge Article 2. It follows that compliance by a member state with the values contained in Article 2 is a condition for the enjoyment of all the rights deriving from the application of the treaties to that member state. In other words, all the goodies you get have to be conditioned on following Article 2. And the values contained in Article 2 define the very identity of the European Union as a common legal order. Thus, the European Union must be able to defend those values within the limits of its powers. Okay, so this was like Big Bang. So what happens? The council then, and the commission has to recommend and the council approves the conditionality regulation, any application of that to a member state. So in December of 2022, they pass actually the first and so far only decision using the conditionality regulation against Hungary, singling out deficiencies in procurement procedures, the high rate of single bid contracts, inadequate systems for detecting conflicts of interest, and then an issue about public interest trusts, which I'd be happy to explain. And it applied to 3 streams of cohesion funds, and then my co-authors, so Dan Kellerman, John Marine, and I, who have been doing this for 10 years now, then write all these things about how to apply it. They didn't do that. But it turns out, and this was the part that actually surprised even those of us following this, the conditionality regulation was not the only place where the commission had decided to insert into the package of laws that always get passed with the budget other conditionalities. So the budget that got passed for the current cycle that we're in had a big problem, which was called Brexit, which blew a hole in the budget. The question, and also there was COVID, which slowed down everybody's economies. How were you going to get the extra money to plug the holes in the budget? The answer was, we're going to go to the markets and raise funds. Controversial, but it worked. And the result was something called the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which had its own regulation. And in the wording of that regulation for all the money that was going to come through this source, it said that EU funds can be frozen if countries fail to comply with country-specific recommendations. That's what the statute says. What are those? Turns out, since the financial crisis, there's something called the European semester, nothing to do with universities. And what it is are these periodic reviews of the macroeconomic conditions to prevent another collapse of the euro, which was, as you recall, something quite imminent for a while after the financial crisis. The country-specific recommendations are usually the results of the macroeconomic review, and they say you need to better align your workforce with the job opportunities, you need to think about, so macroeconomic conditions. However, since 2019, the commission had been inserting judicial independence and corruption into the macroeconomic indicators under this European semester. Okay, which I knew about because once they did that, the European Central Bank has to enforce these things, and they don't know how to enforce rule of law. And so I get this call from the European Central Bank, like, would you come and talk to us about this? So, so trying to go and explain to them like what these country-specific recommendations would mean for Hungary and for Poland, et cetera. So the institutions were kind of on it, but once this fund was passed with that as a condition, what it meant was that suddenly a country that didn't comply with the judicial independence requirements or the anti-corruption measures could have all their funds frozen. And the Common Provisions Regulation, which Dan and I have been saying for years, already had provisions that allowed the commission to cut money. Here, they added another little clause when they repassed the Common Provisions Regulation. Again, 250 pages of accounting standards, so who reads it? They stuck into Article 9, Part 1, if that funds may not be distributed to a state if the member state violates the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This is another treaty that outlines all the rights protected by the EU. If while spending EU funds you violate the charter, the money can be withheld. So what you got suddenly, everyone's focusing on the conditionality regulation, but what you got was three of them. The conditionality regulation applies to all funds, but it requires this like nexus with the budget, okay? And it's recommended by the Commission, must be approved by the Council. Part 2, recovery and resilience regulation builds in these conditionalities for country-specific recommendations, recommended by the Commission, must be approved by the Council. That only applies to funds in that stream. And then you've got the Common Provision Regulation, which applies to everything except agricultural funds and the recovery and resilience funds. And that allows the Commission, acting on its own remit, to withhold any funds that may be used to violate rights, which, by the way, include a right to a fair trial, which is implicated in judicial independence, and so on. Okay, so all of a sudden you had these three. And so what happened? In December 2022, the EU lowered the fiscal boom on Hungary and Poland. And they announced in mid-December, right before Christmas, so lots of people missed it, that $130 billion that would go to Poland from a whole series of funds, everything but agricultural funds, was going to be withheld because of the lack of judicial independence. And they did it using the RFF funds, the resilience funds, and the partnership agreement under the Common Provisions Regulation, which affects all the other funds. So suddenly, when you blow a $130 billion hole in a national budget, people notice. And in Hungary, they withheld money under all three pillars. They withheld about 36 billion from Hungary. And by the way, it's less money, not because the violations were less, but because Hungary's smaller and just has less money. It's basically all the funds except agricultural funds frozen in both cases. And so that 36 billion, some of it came from the conditionality, tiny bit came from conditionality. The entire Recovery and Resilience Fund has still not been distributed to Hungary. And then the Common Provisions Regulation got all the other funds. So this like, boom. And people are like, where did this come from? And the answer was a decade and a half of very hard work. So what has that done? We started with the democracy deficit. What's happened? And I have an article on this in the Journal of European Public Policy. I think you can make the case that it was cutting funds that finally got public attention in these two countries. Both Poland and Hungary always wind up at the top of, if has the EU been good to you? Do you like the EU? However you ask that question, Hungary and Poland usually wind up with the largest percentage of the population thinking the EU is great. A lot of that's because of the money. And so when it became well known in these countries that all the money was gone, and when they started feeling it, how to put it, everybody who was living under austerity notices. I'll just say, Stanford, it's been really interesting being here this quarter, because I know everybody's going through that here, but this is a much bigger cut than what Stanford's had to go through. At the next election, this is when the peace government was voted out, narrowly. So was it because of this? A little hard to tell, although the slogan of the opposition parties was "Return to Europe." And that was really something that was a big deal in the campaign. I'm looking at Anna, so you can confirm or deny, but the fact that suddenly Poland was, was a black sheep in the European family really mattered. In Hungary, Orban had never had a really good challenger until this. And interestingly, Peter Magyar, who is this guy who came out of the middle of Orban's party and suddenly kind of burst onto the scene shortly after all these funds were cut, he had been, before he got into Orban's orbit, his prior job had been working at what's called the Hungarian Perm Rep in Brussels. To translate, he had been one of the Hungarian representatives working in the apparatus that feeds the Council of Ministers. And so he understood the EU stuff pretty well. And so he suddenly bursts out. And what this little graph shows you on the right, orange is always Fidesz, that's their color. Blue is all these other little parties that go to the crater, but there's this black line that just starts in February 2024. And now Peter Magyar is comfortably ahead. This poll stops in June. His lead is widened, so his lead's about 12% ahead of Orban at this stage, with elections next April. But this has really, and his camp, he's constantly battering away at, and we'll get the money back. All right, so I'm just about to close here and just to say, the commission was so thrilled when the government changed hands in Poland that they just gave Poland all the money. The problem is Poland hasn't made the reforms, and that's why it's still so dangerous. It would have been so much more helpful if the commission had still withheld the funds and doled them out when the government was able to pass the reforms, because then they would have had some leverage. But it's just like, hi, welcome, Donald Tusk, and just here's the money. Okay, what's happened with Hungary is that Orban has used his continuing veto over the unanimity files to extract funds. And the biggest example of that was in December 2023 on the vote on Ukrainian accession. Orban basically said, how much will you pay me for my vote? We don't know he said that, but the timing is very suspicious. Right before the meeting, the commission says, Hungary has met its standards for reforming judicial independence, and which they hadn't, but they'd passed some nominal reforms. I wrote a bunch about why they didn't comply, but it was clear the commission wanted to give Hungary money. So they suddenly give them a green light on judicial independence. They then give Hungary $10.2 billion unlocked in December 2023, and Orban absents himself and goes to the bathroom during the vote, and they declare it unanimous. But there's a second vote on then giving a lot of money to Ukraine, and Orban comes back into the room and vetoes that, saying how much you. So anyway, it's expensive. Orban, at every time you need unanimity in the council now, Orban is like, how much will you pay me for my vote? Okay, so this was the scandal. There's more about it here, but this deal that they made to give Orban money. All I'll say about this is now the parliament is suing them. The parliament suing the commission, saying, look, we believe in all this conditionality stuff. How can you possibly think the Hungarians met the conditions? Here too, I might say I've been working with the Parliament's legal service on all of this. I go around to all the institutions and feed them information about Hungary and EU law and what we're doing about all this stuff. So they have this pending case now suing the Commission to claw back the money from Hungary again. And so what about Hungary? What about the European Union's deficit? Well, the Court of Justice has said all the values are enforceable. I'm highlighting here rule of law is what they've leaned everything on so far, but there's democracy in there too. So here's what my group is now doing, like all of us who've been pushing this thing along for 12 years. We've now started to say, well, look, we have countries where the elections are rigged. And there's Article 10 of the Treaty on European Union, which says, in Article 10.2 says member states are represented in the European Council by their heads of state or government, and in the Council by their governments themselves, democratically accountable to either the national parliaments or to their citizens. So now we're starting to work on that. I will not go through all of this, but we've been building up a set of working papers on all the ways in which the elections in Hungary are rigged, why this violates principles of free and fair elections, including for European elections, but also for the national elections, because it's the national elections that certify their governments as democratic back to where we started on the democracy deficit. And so I'm going to end with this. This is Koen Lenaerts. He's the president of the European Court of Justice. He gave a speech last week in which he said, EU law is by its very nature the law of democracy, and it contributes to building trust in the democratic process, protects civil engagement, and long-term stability based on the rule of law. And as the case law of the Court of Justice shows, the value of democracy pervades the entire body of EU law. So what we're all doing now is teeing up cases to get to the Commission on democracy. So it's not yet the end. I'll stop there. All right, that took long. It was 15 years of work to get to that point.
Terrific.
Sorry.
So, as is our wont, we'll run the Q&A with her usual efficient style.
All right, thanks for that. Lots of pressure. Okay, Christophe, I saw you first.
Yeah.
I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
So you showed us how important the role of the Court of Justice has been in all of this. Is there a danger that with more right-wing governments coming to power in different countries that they will appoint judges that are not so much in favor of ruling on the rule of law and so on, and that this whole system at some point, as far as the judiciary is concerned, will stop working? My second question is a bit more speculation. There's a question that I've wondered about, and I'm sure you have a way better answer to, since you know so much more about Hungary. So there is an election in Hungary, as you mentioned, in April, and it looks like Orban will lose that election. The system is not really very fair, but still, if that were to happen, do you think that he would give up power, or would he use violence to stay in power?
Yeah. So the ECJ, when governments nominate judges, there's a procedure, a vetting procedure they go through. And in fact, the vetting procedure has been pretty good at excluding judges who are either unqualified or clearly in the pocket of these rogue governments. And so far, the Court of Justice has been okay. And it's got that Article 57 committee, I think it's called, which screens the judges. And they've gone back to Hungary, they've gone back to Poland and said, give us more nominees if they don't feel like any of them are qualified. So that's got a good kind of break, on that. On the elections, so what Orban's done, I mean, I have a whole other thing, but my 2022 Journal of Democracy paper goes through this, but the system in Hungary is so rigged. And before every election, Orban further rigs it. So they've already made several hundred changes to the election law in the run-up to this election. They've done a whole series of other things. They're trying to disqualify Peter Magyar. He's unfortunately hot-tempered. Somebody provoked him into a fire brawl, and he threw somebody's phone into the Danube. So now, Magyar, it could happen to anyone. They're also he divorced the former justice minister, and obviously needs a woman. And they've given him all these women who bug him, and then put the conversations up on social media. I mean, it's just they're trying everything. And he's just been staying there in the polls, very popular despite all the campaigns. So there's a lot of stuff they're doing to go after him. And here's where, again, the commission could be helpful. A year ago, when this all started looking like that they might lose the election, the Hungarian government created something called the Sovereignty Protection Authority, which has unlimited and basically unsupervised powers to investigate anyone who has access to the public space in Hungary, who may be have foreign funding. And so they opened an investigation against Peter Magyar. It means if you try to give money to him or his campaign, you will immediately disqualify him, so don't try it. There was a group of Americans who did this in the last election, and anyway, so just don't fund them. You can do all kinds of other stuff, but no money. But they're just investigating him for everything. And they can make criminal referrals to the prosecutor, who's a captured office. And you can tell that they're building up to something, who knows what. He's a member of the European Parliament because his party ran in the 2024 elections and he got elected. At first, he said he wasn't going to take his seat, that he'd have someone else from his party. And then people explained European parliamentary immunity to him, and he thought, I'm going to take the seat. So he's never in Brussels, but he benefits from parliamentary immunity. Hungary's asked for his immunity to be lifted, and the parliament just refused, which is good. Okay, but so they're trying absolutely everything. If in fact Magyar wins, I mean, I think, first of all, I think he can't because of the way the system's set. And then there's just going to be a denial of all of this. But what you also see happening, this happened before 2018 when they thought they might lose. They're starting to transfer assets to these public interest. The direct translation of this Hungarian word that's that long is public interest asset management foundations. Private law foundations where they're transferring public assets to these foundations, controlled by a board that's appointed by Orban, and those boards can disperse all those assets however they want. It's the way that they preserve their access to money while they're out of power. And you can see before the 2018 election, and then it speeded up again before 2022, the first public institutions, public concentrations of assets that they transferred to these management foundations were the universities. So the universities have almost all been privatized, following Finland, which privatized its universities, but not for this aim. They transferred the universities, the buildings, the contracts, the libraries, the land, and then they started transferring resorts on the Balaton and shares in the Hungarian oil company, all to these university foundations run by Orban's cronies. And they can just liquidate the assets and pocket them if they lose. So they also have an escape plan. Sorry, had to just, because it's, we don't know. I mean, I think if power actually transfers peaceably as a result of an election that is either fairer or freer than the past ones have been, I will be very surprised. But who knows? Yeah, sorry.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We have 15 minutes.
Oh,
So
sorry.
Amichai and Marcel, and then I'll come back. And wait, I see Eric, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Yes, you.
Oh, you.
Yes. No, you're not just tell me your name.
Oh, Barry Lieber.
Okay, Barry. 1 second. Okay, Amichai and Marcel.
Okay. So I have a little comment, and then I want to play devil's advocate a little bit to challenge you, because you're very much kind of playing EU law inside baseball.
Sure.
The little comment is that under Article 49 of the Treaty of European Union, as you know, compliance with Article 2 is a precondition for eligibility for membership. And so if Article 2 is now actionable, that will be transformative for member states and potential member states as well.
Exactly.
There's a great book by John Peavyhouse from 2006 called Democracy from Above that I think might be of interest to you in that regard. Okay, now I'm going to play devil's advocate. And, if I was JD Vance, we're in an elite liberal bubble, and now I'm going to try to burst it a little bit. So I'm JD Vance, and I'm thinking to myself, Professor spoke about democratic deficits, but there are really sort of two democratic deficits in the EU, the one that you've spoken about and the one that you haven't. And the one that you haven't spoken about is arguably the deeper and more fundamental democratic deficit, which is the fact that Europe is not a demos. People don't go and fight and die for the EU. When there's a big crisis, EU member states shut their borders and take care of their own citizens first. And we had this attempt in 2003 to pass an EU constitution. It failed. The Dutch rejected it. The Irish rejected it, not exactly anti-Europeans. So the fundamental democratic deficit is that there's no European demos, which turns this whole exercise into this incredibly legalistic, technocratic, elite, deep state project that normal Europeans don't understand, feel that it's incredibly, it's deliberately set up so that they don't understand it. And therefore, it is fundamentally anti-democratic. And I'm just afraid that all these tools are going to produce a backlash, as they are producing a backlash, not just in Hungary and Poland, but also elsewhere in the EU, that will reinforce this narrative, which I reject normatively, that this is purely an elite-driven, technocratic, deep state, unelected, unaccountable cabal, Brussels cabal, that is shoving this thing down our throat, and therefore let's dismantle it. What do we do with that?
Well, that's exactly the.
Sorry.
Before you answer that, let me
That's
bring
what
in
happened.
Marcel, and then we'll turn back to you.
Sorry to do that.
I agree. At the beginning of your presentation, you introduced these 3 steps that the Commission could have done initially. And the second step was sanctions to be decided at unanimity. And you explained that with 2 countries are undemocratic, you couldn't do it. But then when Poland reverted, why didn't the Commission use that?
Yeah, good question.
You go ahead.
Okay, so first of all, the backlash is already there. I mean, that was I put up the Patriot. If you read the Patriots for Europe party platform, it's exactly about reverting to the nations and enough of this democratic stuff. And this is exactly what all the far right parties are doing, and they're gaining. And they're gaining not only in numbers, but number of different governments. I have no idea what's going to happen in the French election next year. I mean, so this could be the end of the European project, absolutely. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that this is a crack that can open and blow up the whole thing. And the Patriots platform gives you exactly what the alternative is. It's just an ATM cash redistribution machine, basically. So, but this is where Cohn Leonard's has been on fire. And the people who are trying to defend this are trying to make the values argument and trying to restore, what was the EU for? Why did we get this far? And what's so interesting is that it's the countries in which these far right parties are making the biggest advances that, again, in the Eurobarometer, are most in favor of the EU. So the EU needs to do better messaging about what this is about, and also needs to then make the case about, get a lot of the stuff out of the shadows. I mean, if you've ever worked with EU institutions, you'll know that transparency is not what they do. I mean, just for example, at the Court of Justice, the pleadings of the parties, like the briefs, are not public. The documents, I mean, almost all negotiations on legislation are done in so-called trilogues, where you get the commission and the council and the parliament represented behind closed doors. And then they come out with the bill. So you can't even get a good legislative history of what different groups advocated. So the EU needs to work on its own internal democracy promotion and needs to be much less technocratic and much less secret. But they're so focused so they need to work on both. I mean, and it's a race to see which one is winning. I don't think democracy is winning. I'm sort of the pro-democracy person and the pro-EU person, but yeah, I'm sure you are too, but just read the platform of patriots and they're involved. And we're getting now in Europe the exact thing, Dan Zyblatt warns us all against, which is that the center-right party is starting to work with the far right. And the EPP has done a lot of business with patriots. And von der Leyen is supporting all of that because she's EPP through and through. This is just party for center right works with far right, and this is the commission during which you'll see all that. But yeah, so that and then just on the right, I didn't write down your question. Oh, sorry. On Poland, why didn't they do Article 2? Yeah, Article 7. So part of it was that they never had gotten enough agreement to get to Article 7.1, which requires 4/5 of the member states. Basically, the member states don't want to punish each other. And partly, people in the council say, like at European Council, when there's just 27 of them around the table, and Viktor Orban's been there now 15 years. He has more seniority than anyone else. They know each other personally. To vote against their, and Orban can be very charming. And apparently what everybody tells me at the council, also council ministers, the Hungarians come in, they're the best prepared, they're the best lawyers in the room, they have the best technical legal arguments, they run circles around everybody else, and it's just very hard to counter them in those meetings. So they've never come close. Now, what I do know, is this it's recorded?
It's on Zoom, so.
It's on Zoom. Okay, well, I mean,
It's very public.
I'm speaking to millions. Okay, so all I'll say is that the council
You're speaking to
two. Okay, fine.
Potentially millions.
Okay.
Potentially.
So the council, all I'll say is the council legal service has the documents prepared. That if you get one of these unanimity votes and Hungary is being obstreperous and they come in and say, how much will you? The other countries are so fed up with Hungary that there's a document they can whip out and vote. And the Hungarians know that. So all these European Council meetings are just cliffhanger meetings where does Orban get paid or do they do it? And maybe. So
Great, thank you. Okay, Barry and then Eric.
If Peter Magyar does become prime minister, what can he do to unwind everything that Fidesz and Orban have done? He'll face the same problems that were in Poland, won't he?
yes.
Okay, and Eric.
That's the answer.
It's a story of creative and persistent lawyering. And the story isn't over, but 12 years is a slog. So congratulations on that. But I wonder if we can take this, the Hungary and Poland examples, and think about what advice you would give to Maia Sandu in Moldova, a judiciary that is mostly corrupt, has been involved in its own version of the Brazilian car wash, and really needs to transition, and they're cracking their heads open trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. Do you take these two?
Yep.
Okay, so the answer is yes. On Hungary, it's even worse in Hungary because things are more legally entrenched. On the other hand, again, this is the other thing. I don't mean to just put myself in the middle, but it's the stuff I know because I went from trying to write about it outside to trying to figure out how to do it inside. In the 2022 election, I worked with the Hungarian opposition to think about, so if you win, then what? And the Hungarian opposition produced a 100-page manifesto basically saying that many of the laws that have entrenched these problems in Hungary are law, they require 2/3 vote of the parliament. One thing to say is Orban not only has rigged the elections in Hungary, but he has had a 2/3 majority of a unicameral parliament in a system where a single 2/3 vote of the unicameral parliament can change anything in the constitution. That's why all this has been happening. Yeah, legally, right? And they put in place, they locked in everything they care about. So as long as Orban keeps 1/3 in the parliament, he can block any change in the system. So what the opposition did based on a plan that, again, my colleagues and I came up with is to say, so much of this violates EU law by now. And EU law has primacy, but even for the positivist lawyers in Hungary who don't understand what that means, the EU treaties were also 2/3 laws. And the Constitution still says international law takes precedence over domestic law. So what we've been doing is going through and finding all the areas detailed in Hungarian law where EU law should override what's been done, and to use that as a way of undoing and rolling back a lot of the formal legal changes. The problem is always, what do you do with the occupants of the offices? You can change the law, but then you've got all these judges who've been appointed over 15 years, or in Poland this is the problem Poland's had. Poland has less the problem of awful laws because a lot of what they did was unconstitutional to begin with. So if you can fix the constitutional tribunal, you can get the laws declared unconstitutional under the Polish constitution. The problem is the occupants. And so this is where one of the proposals is that, and this is, I'll tell you the generic version because it may work here in the US. What you need is an external monitor. Could be, dignified people from your own system. It could be, in the case of Europe, I propose the Venice Commission. You need somebody outside the system to say, when the new government comes in, changes the laws and fires people, that it isn't the same power grab that happened before. And how do you distinguish one from the other? The second one, when the pro-democratic forces come to power, are trying to create a system in line with their international treaty commitments, with EU law, with the European human rights system. And so what you need is a monitor who's there to say it's not just a power grab. Anytime the new government takes the inevitable temptation to just lock their own people in or do that kind of thing, the monitor will scream and say, no, you can't do that. So if you set up that kind of system, then I think you can distinguish the two cases and keep on a good kind of track. So that's what I think they could do. Now, the question is, as for the accession countries, so one thing we've learned is that the accession processes were probably not rigorous enough anywhere along in the chain. The current accession countries are in even more problematic state than any of the countries that have eventually joined were in. I mean, it's just really hard to see how any countries, and let's take Ukraine, where there's tons of resources being put into trying to fix the problem in Ukraine. You just saw the corruption scandal that affected the whole energy sector. The judiciary's got the same problem. And so these countries are going to take a very long time, and corruption is the biggest problem. And I don't know that we really have very good fixes for how to fix corruption, except a wholesale getting rid of people and bringing in new people. And, it's just really, really a puzzle. But what the EU is now doing, which I think is really interesting, is that all those East European countries and others, right, who had to go through a complicated accession process to get in, did change quite quickly during accession. And then after accession, like rolling back. Okay. What the EU has been thinking about, what von der Leyen's already doing, is thinking about the EU membership as kind of one circle, and then various degrees of partial membership. So the accession countries, for example, now can send their heads of state or their cabinet members as observers to the council meetings, so that they get some practice in how people talk about this stuff. They have sort of shadow observers in the European Parliament. They're sort of half in the institutions as kind of a waiting room, and they're getting some money that comes with some of these same constraints that the conditionality regulations and all three of them now have. So essentially what the EU is doing is throwing out little bits of EU quasi-membership, as opposed to having a big bang entry. And what that may be a permanent structure, right, where the countries never get in full membership, just the way now the countries in the Eurozone who've adopted the euro as a currency have somewhat more integration into the European system. For example, their finance ministers sit on the central bank presidents sit on the European Central Bank board, but the countries not in the euro don't have representation on the central bank board. So you're already seeing kind of degrees of integration into the system. And I think what's going to happen with accession is that there are going to be degrees of non-admission into the EU, in which the whole thing becomes a sliding scale of different levels of integration, and that is probably going to be the best we can do.
All right, well, that's our time. Kim, thank you for doing this. That was really masterful.